national voting rights correspondent for Mother Jones and the author of the book Minority Rule, Ari Berman. Ari, thanks for joining me again.
Hey, Brian, great to talk to you again. Thank you.
So let's take a look at the landscape here. Republicans lost two races in Pennsylvania. They underperformed by 16 points in Florida. They lost the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. That really was a referendum on Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And just this past weekend, watched massive rallies in all 50 states turn out millions of people across the country. How much of a blinking red light is this for the Republican Party as we head toward midterms here?
Brian, I think that Democrats and progressives are finally finding their voice and awakening from that slumber, you might say coma, that they were in after November and realizing that they can fight back against Trump, both in symbolic and then in very real, tangible ways. And, the best way to, get over a hangover is to do something about it. Drink your electrolytes and go on to the next thing. And that's
Yeah.
what they seem to be doing here. And so these special elections, and particularly the one in Wisconsin, which was a statewide election, really offered them an opportunity to have a new playbook and show that they figured out a way to fight Trump and all the unpopular things he's doing.
I'm curious as we look at this in the context of whether Democrats have figured out a strategy forward, or if you think that it's more a referendum on the unpopularity of this administration, and whether that means that Democrats have fixed some of the existential problems that we were contending with as we to have an introspective look at the 2024 election. Obviously, we've lost broad swaths of the electorate. Whether this fixes some of those problems, whether Democrats are helping redefine themselves after their brand took such a hit, or if it's just yet again relying on a lot of anti-Trump sentiment, which is not to minimize that. I mean, that was responsible for Democrats winning the House by the biggest margin in modern American history back in 2018.
Well, it's like you have a house and the house got demolished, right? And then all you have is the foundation, and you have to start rebuilding it frame by frame. And they've rebuilt some of it through what's happened. I don't think anyone believes that Democrats have their entire house in order or they've
Right.
fixed all the problems for from 2024. I mean, that would be naive to think that right now. And I don't know any Democrat that would say that. But I
Right.
do think that they've shown in these more targeted special elections, in these races that can be made into a referendum on Trump, or in the case of Wisconsin, a referendum on Elon Musk, that they're starting to figure out at least how to motivate their own voters,
Yeah.
which is a really big part of it because Democratic voters were totally demoralized. And many of them are still very angry with the National Party and they want to do something about it. And they say if they don't see Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries fighting, they want to see someone else fighting. And often those fights are happening at the state and local level. And that was one of the big things that I heard when I visited Wisconsin was forget about what's happening in the national party. If we can defeat Elon Musk in Wisconsin, we'll be able to send a message to the national party that there's a way to resist Trump in a tangible way and actually win.
Ari, do you think that the Republicans view their National Party apparatus as a drag in the same way that Democrats do? Like, I feel like Democrats bolster their credentials by being able to disparage or run away from the National Party, whereas I don't necessarily know that it's the same sense with Republicans as it relates to the RNC.
No, I mean, I think that Republicans much more blindly follow whatever their
Yeah.
leaders are doing. I mean, there's about 30,000 examples now of them blindly following Trump, even when he does things like tariffs that go against everything that they're
like
supposed to believe
like
as a party.
crash the global
Yes.
economy. But yes,
Yeah.
aside from that,
Yes, like
yeah.
crash the global economy and destroy the free market, which if you were believed in nothing else as a Republican, it was supposed to be the efficacy of the free market. Now, of course, they're trying to justify that. But I think we saw, interestingly enough, in the state Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, the conservative candidate Brad Schimmel tied himself very closely to Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And I think that was a mistake. And they were operating on the basis that if they could just get Trump voters to the polls, they could win that election. And they said over and over, if we get 60% of Trump voters to the polls, will win. Well, it's interesting. They got 62% of Trump voters to the polls, and he lost by 10 points because the progressive candidate, Susan Crawford, got 77% of Harris voters to the
Yeah.
polls, which is extraordinary to think that nearly 80% of the people who voted for Kamala Harris in November showed up again for a state
Right.
Supreme Court race in April. So I think a lot of it's just going to be about mobilizing in these elections in 2025 and 2026. In 2028, it's going to have to be a bigger picture thing to figure out what the Democratic Party stands for, who it's going to fight for, how to get back some of the voters it lost. All of those things are still, they have to deal with. But a lot of what's going to happen in 2025 and 2026 is just mobilizing their own voters to turn out in future elections, because that's one way they failed a lot in 2024.
Well, we've obviously seen how there has been a shift in who turns out for these midterm cycles. Way back when, before I even started paying attention to politics, it was Republicans who had the edge because they appealed more to older voters who are more reliable voters. And so, in these special elections, in midterm elections, it's Republicans who would overperform. That's flipped since Democrats have really garnered more of a voting bloc that includes college educated voters and whatnot. And so now it's Democrats who overperform in these special elections. I'm curious whether you think for the midterm cycle where Trump is not on the ballot, and that seems to be when Republicans really manage to overperform. When he's not on the ballot, if you think that that will be a situation where this same trend will continue, Democrats will have a better performance, and it's the general election cycle, or when Trump specifically is on the ballot, that Republicans have found their footing.
I think that it's going to be a problem for Republicans because Trump's unpopular policies will be on the ballot, but he will not be on the ballot. So that's kind of the worst possible thing for
Right.
Republicans is they have to
Right.
defend.
You kind of lose like the cult effect, the people who will
Exactly.
turn out for him regardless, but you do still shoulder all of the blame for his for what he's ushering in.
Yeah, and Republicans are going to have to defend everything. I mean, there's a long time between now and November 2026, but I mean, they're going to have to defend the chaos, the dysfunction, and the very real turmoil that people are now feeling in their everyday lives because of Trump. And they're going to have to defend why they rubber stamped what is an increasingly unpopular agenda. And so I think it's going to be a problem for them. It's already been a problem for them in these special elections. And you look at what Democrats and progressives are doing; they are winning in these swing areas and these even Trump-leaning counties. When I look at the Wisconsin race and I saw that the progressive candidate Susan Crawford flipped 10 counties that voted for Donald Trump in November. That's very, very significant. If they start flipping those kind of areas, it puts a lot more seats in play right now. Because, I mean, you look at the House, Democrats could win 5 seats in the House and they could narrowly take it back, or they could start performing like they did in special elections, right? And then you start talking about maybe winning 20, 30, 40 seats. So it's a
Right.
total different ballgame if they can go in and win some of these more red leaning or at least purple areas.
Ari, at the same time, there was the North Carolina appeals court decision in favor of Jefferson Griffin. That's the conservative candidate for the North Carolina Supreme Court, and that decision was in favor of discarding 68,000 ballots unless they can be cured. And that kind of highlights a broader problem here, which is that the Republican Party is perfectly content and willing to just undermine free and fair elections. And so am I being naive here? Are we being naive here in thinking about this within the confines, within the framework of politics as usual? Like we're talking about the midterms and kind of whistling past the graveyard here in the sense that Republicans have shown that if they need to go outside of the rules, outside of the confines of the rules, that they're perfectly willing to do that.
Yeah, and we already know that from what Trump tried to do in 2020. The big difference in North Carolina is Republicans might actually succeed in stealing the election there. This is like January 6th without the insurrection. They have taken the Trump playbook from 2020 and are now using it to try to overturn an election in North Carolina in a case that I think is going to have major national ramifications. Because if they're able to overturn a Democratic victory in North Carolina, that's going to be the playbook they use in future elections, even more than the Trump playbook. because it's going to be a successful one, which is if
Right.
you don't like the election result and it's close enough to be able to challenge the ballots, you can just essentially invent new rules for the election, cherry pick who you're going to challenge, which votes you're going to throw out, and find a court system that is favorable to you. Republicans control the courts in North Carolina. They have huge majorities on both the Court of Appeals, which has issued this decision, and the state Supreme Court. And there's no real guardrails to hold them in effect other than maybe the federal courts getting involved here or voters being able to cure those ballots that are being challenged. But it's extraordinarily dangerous. It doesn't seem to be getting as much attention as what happened in Wisconsin because you don't have Trump or Musk directly involved. But I'm very, very worried what message it would send for democracy if Republicans are just able to outright steal a state Supreme Court election in North Carolina. What happens in North Carolina is not going to stop there.
Right. I mean, I interviewed Justice Riggs yesterday. I've had her on my show once every couple of weeks here as we continue to work our way through this process. But the reality is that the appeals court ruled in favor of her opponent. Now it's going to get appealed up to the state Supreme Court, where because she had to recuse, now it's five Republicans and one Democrat who's going to be ruling on this case. And so even if you have a few conservative jurists who are willing to buck the party line, the reality is that Jefferson Griffin is probably going to win at the state Supreme Court, and then it's just a matter of, okay, will this thing be able to hop from the state court system into the federal court system, and what happens in the federal court system? Because the final arbiter in the federal court system is the U.S. Supreme Court, and it doesn't exactly inspire confidence when you've got Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, the final arbiters waiting to determine this thing at the end of the day.
No, for sure. I mean, the federal courts aren't much better. I think the difference, though, is that the federal courts stopped the effort to steal the 2020 election. And they have been willing, in certain cases so far, to rule against some of Trump's most extreme actions in terms of violating the Constitution. And I think that this is not that dissimilar from what happened in 2020, where Trump made all these wild claims of voter fraud and people looked at the evidence and realized there was no there. And in the
Yeah.
same way, in North Carolina, Jefferson Griffin hasn't actually been able to point to any evidence, any instances of illegal voting. There's things he doesn't like. He doesn't like the fact that people may have been able to register with what he claims are incomplete registrations because of failures in the state's database, or military voters didn't have to show ID when they cast ballots. But those were all things that were agreed upon at the time. And to
Right.
challenge
And so you
those,
have the Purcell doctrine comes into place, which I guess would prevent changes from being made too close to the election at this point.
yeah, and not only that, but I mean, there's really substantive federal due process concerns. Griffin is only challenging early and absentee ballots. So he's just not even challenging ballots that were cast on election day because those are more Republican. He's challenging, for example, military ballots and overseas ballots only in one county in North Carolina, which voted overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris. So, I mean, he's going about this in a way that raises concerns for future elections and raises concerns under the Constitution in a way that could be troubling. For the federal courts. Because on the state level, what the state justices who are Republicans are trying to do, they just want to put their buddy on the bench, basically. And they're willing to bend any kind of law or precedent to be able to do that. But the federal courts could look at some of these bigger constitutional issues and say the state court has gone too far in terms of what they've done. But I mean, that is really the only recourse here unless there's this extraordinary effort to cure these ballots that are being challenged. And that's going to have to be done within a 15-day period. It's not gone into effect yet, but 2 weeks to fix 60,000 ballots. That's a pretty big organizing haul.
Right. And hopefully we're in a situation where the federal courts will step in anyway to preclude this process from moving forward so that we don't have to engage in this farcical process where we have to pretend all of a sudden that because the Republican candidate doesn't like the outcome of the election, that we're not supposed to accept it. So, obviously some good news here as it relates to Democratic overperformance in these elections, and some bad news as it relates to Republican efforts to yet again undermine free and fair elections. So, Ari, I appreciate your work. I appreciate you talking to me today. And again, for those who are watching right now, if you want to support Ari or hear, see, or read more from him, check out Mother Jones, or you can buy Minority Rule, which was a great read. Ari, appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Brian. Great to talk to you again.